Hi, James. Thank you so much for joining us today on legalizedfreedom.com. You and I have known each other for a long time. We've got very similar um, interests and obsessions when it comes to TV and movies. This is part of my review series, Hauntology Dystopia, which I've been doing probably about a year now. Today, we're going to be talking about the early works of David Cronenberg, but also, his entire oeuvre, as it were, through the lens of these films. So before we get started, maybe just tell listeners a little bit about yourself and when you first discovered Cronenberg.
Hi, Greg. I'm James Rose, and I'm a writer. I kind of specialise in horror and science fiction film and television. My first book, Beyond Hammer, is about British horror films since the 1970s, and that kind of typifies a lot of the work that I do. I'm interested in British horror films in particular and what they have to say about British filmmakers, what they have to say about the British experience, and what they have to say about British culture. And that sort of naturally leads into other writing and other publications about North American cinema in particular, because it's so dominant in the horror and science fiction field. In terms of when I first came across David Cronenberg, I suppose I was quite young in some respects, in that I'd always go into the local library, my local town, with my dad every Saturday. He would go and get some novels, and I'd always go to the cinema section. There was a reasonable section of films, books about films. And one of them that I constantly looked at was called Fantastic Cinema, an Illustrated Survey by Peter Nichols. And the reason why I liked it, I never really read it until much later on. The reason why I liked it was really heavily illustrated. And the thing that really appealed to me was that there were sections about film directors, very specific film directors. And I would always look at two, John Carpenter and George A. Romero. And after George A. Romero, if I remember correctly, it was Wes Craven, and then it was David Cronenberg. And I was just aware more of John Carpenter and George Romero through the things that my dad would talk about and the things that dad would be watching. And also going to the local video shop, because we're talking about like the 1980s here, and the home video boom has arrived, and we're always going down there every weekend and hiring a film out together as a family. But while I'm in there, I'm also looking at the horror section, and I'm aware of these really quite scary covers, all sorts of monsters on them. And again, this is before sort of like the Video Recordings Act. So you're seeing some pretty graphic imagery, and Cronenberg's name is in my consciousness. And I'm sort of connecting these sort of visual experiences in the video shop with this sort of vague, ambiguous chapter in this fantastic cinema book. And slowly but surely, the older I get, the more I watch, the more I keep going back to this book, the more I read it. Eventually, I read this chapter on Cronenberg, and it just sort of blows my mind. It's just kind of like, this is amazing stuff. And then sort of by the time I'm old enough to watch his films properly, he's made The Fly, and that just was amazing, absolutely amazing. And I think it sort of tied in with the point of which I was seeing films for their meaning or their metaphor or for their cultural value. I wasn't just watching it for the sake of watching a horror film, or watching it for the sake of some gore or special effects, because I just absolutely in love with special effects at that time. And kind of like watching it for that, I was starting to think, hold on a minute, that monster, that man turning into a fly means something. And so Cronenberg has got this kind of history with me growing up, but also this sort of history of guiding me into starting to understand films in a completely different way. So he's quite important ultimately to my sort of writing practice, or at least the foundations of it.
Okay, so what we're looking at today really is to say his first four pieces: Transfer, 1966, From the Drain, 1967, Stereo, 1969, and Crimes of the Future, 1970, not to be confused with the recent film that he's done under that same title, Crimes of the Future, which really bears only a passing resemblance in certain aspects. It's not a remake, anything like that at all. For me, these are interesting because you have there in these four pieces all of his Cronenberg's obsessions and predilections and concerns and interests kind of summed up, everything that he'd go on to expand upon in
Definitely.
future. You know, that you mentioned horror, I mean, body horror, particularly in his case. You're talking about, there's a visceral quality to so many of his films. Even the ones, by the way, he's by no means limited to sci-fi and horror, as listeners will know if they've followed his work. But it's a a dominant theme: body transformation, disease, psychological dimensions intertwining with physical, technology as a concern, and you see it throughout. All of his best known films in sci-fi horror. For my part, I will just say I discovered him channel surfing, such as it was in the 80s. It was 4 channels when Channel 4 launched. And I don't remember where it was screening, but on one of the channels, I stumbled upon Scanners from 1981. And still to this day, I think if there was only one desert island movie from Cronenberg that I could take with me, it probably would be Scanners, maybe just because that was my first exposure to him. So so we're looking at all of his concerns laid out here for us, all of these things that we developed throughout his career.
Definitely, I think without any doubt, if you've seen his later work first and then you look at these 4 early films in particular, it's undeniable. It's palpable. You can feel it and you can see it. You can almost hear it. Everything that Cronenberg wants to be, or what Cronenberg will become, is being played out. It's been experimented with. It's being given an opportunity to be explored. And I think when you sort of watch them again, you're aware that they're experimental films. And they're experimental films in the traditional sort of sense of an experimental film or a genre of a type of film. But they're very experimental for him. It's almost like he's saying, if I put this interest and this interest together in this film, what happens? What comes out of it? And then it's left only to be picked up 5, 6, perhaps even a decade later in a much more mature film where it's fully realized. And I think that's the absolutely fascinating thing about watching them, is you can almost play sort of like David Cronenberg bingo with it, really. You've just listed a number of things that sort of dominate his films. One of them that sort of I was thinking when you're saying it is that sort of the high sexual content and the sexual sort of relationships that take place within it, and how those sexual relationships interact with the bodies of the characters. And all of those things, you can tick them off through these 4 films. It's just staggering how his directorial autograph or his directorial imprint is so evident in these first 4 films. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, not to get ahead of ourselves really here, but in Crimes of the Future, when it touches upon pedophilia, I mean, if you just read the synopsis of that film, it's like so disturbing. But sexuality being one of his, as you say, main concerns. And also he spotted this in the work of others, like, for example, in Crash, J.G. Ballard, the sexual content of that, the theme there, not Cronenberg's work, but he's adapted it for the screen, and and then you look at Dead Ringers, for example, again, not his story, but the sexuality, the content in that. But to get ourselves started, so we're looking at Transfer, as I said, 1966 being the first of these 4, and it's only 7 minutes long. The first 2 films are very, very short, and straight away here we're diving into the mental, the psychological dimension of Cronenberg's work. The protagonists here, just 2 of them, a psychiatrist and his patient. And if there's one thing I think that Cronenberg managed to do, whether deliberately or not, in all of his work, even say in other genres beyond sci-fi and horror, is just unsettle the viewer. I found that to be, and even something like Spider is a very obvious case, but even in A History of Violence, something like such a straightforward film that many people wouldn't necessarily attribute to Cronenberg if they didn't know. There's just this disturbing dimension to it, a psychological dimension that I don't think he can really function without doing that. I think it's just as part of him, really, you know.
That first film, the transfer, it is disturbing. When you get past the side of perhaps almost the clunkiness of some of the scripting and the abstract nature of the fact that they're in the middle of a snowy field having a meal together, if you kind of push that to one side and listen to what's being said, or perhaps more accurately just look at what's happening, that is very palpable, isn't it? The conflict and the tension between a doctor and their patient. And although there's lots and lots of different things going on there, it's almost what we said just a few minutes ago. It's a fundamental concern of Cronenberg's, that relationship, that doctor or that person of science and their relationship to someone else, be that their patient, or in the case of The Fly, because perhaps that's something I mentioned there as my point of contact, is the scientist Brundle and his relationship with the journalist played by Gina Davis, and how their dialogue works with one another. And even in the, I mean, it is unsettling in Transfer, particularly what's going on and the tensions between them. But even in The Fly, when Brundle is sort of trying to seduce Gina Davis's character, it's uncomfortable. There's something not quite right about that dynamic, and then that finds itself in lots of other versions of his film. So, like in The Brood, Oliver Reed's character, the sort of the head of the Soma Free Institute, and what he's doing with his patients. And then there's, I guess, the most obvious one is Beverly Mansell in Dead Ringers, and his brother Elliot, and how they interact with each other as doctor and patient, even though both of them are doctors. And I don't want to give anything away, but the ending in particular plays out the doctor-patient dynamic and how unsettling that can be. So I think you're right. There's something very textural about that tension, and then it builds up, like you said, in just those 7 minutes. You're just kind of thinking, what on earth's going to go on in this, and why is it going in the direction that it is?
Yeah, well, there's a dynamic doctor-patient dynamic in that film that you see played out in other films that deal with psychiatry, you know, whether tangentially or, you know, centrally. The patient in making things up, you know, to what extent, you know, that their condition is imagined. I mean, you can talk all day about mental health in that context, can't you, really? You know, how much is this, you know, where does the line occur between, you know, I imagine that I am mentally ill, I am mentally ill. Is that in itself, you know, a symptom of mental illness? And you see that in Transfer. This, you know, you get this impression rather that the patient, you know, obviously this is the most meaningful relationship he's ever had. And in fact, if we talk about psychotherapy, you know, culture, and where is it? It's biggest in the world, probably the United States. What is the meaning of the relationship between therapist and patient in those contexts? And again, in TV and film, you often get the impression, you know, writers and directors are giving us that there's a reciprocal thing going on here, but really the patient is seeing the therapist for reasons other than those which would superficially seem to be the case.
It's also the other way around sometimes, isn't it? Is that the client goes to the doctor for therapy, but what we're really seeing is the doctor getting therapy. Sometimes it rotates round, and that potentially happens in Transfer, that at the beginning there's a clear power sort of structure there, that the doctor's in charge, the patient is there as a secondary figure. But as that film progresses through its short runtime, that balance of power may or may not shift depending on how you interpret that dynamic. It's quite interesting and perhaps coincidental that last night I was having a look at the special edition double disc or Arrow releases video of Clive Barker's Nightbreed, which of course David Cronenberg it's got a significant acting part in, and he plays a psychiatrist, Dr. David Decker. And those things that you were talking about the relationship and the dynamic, and am I mentally ill or am I here for other reasons, is played out perfectly in that film through the character of Boone, and what the doctor, what Decker does to him and what he does to Boone is consistently lie and manipulate him into becoming more insane, for the want of a better term. But then that gets totally inverted by Barker's imagination and Barker's notion of Midian and all of the creatures that exist in Midian. But I think that's kind of interesting that Cronenberg is chosen for a major role in a film playing a deranged, sort of mentally ill psychiatrist. I think that's quite, there's a lot going on there in terms of why Cronenberg was chosen.
Oh, there is. And actually, that had slipped my mind, that role, to be honest. I've not watched that movie in a long time. But it's interesting. I find it fascinating when you get people who, writers or directors who take on acting roles when it's something that they've never worked at, studied for. And I'm reminded of this very often, comedians who make the transition to acting, who've had no formal training whatsoever. And you can see classically trained actors being quite annoyed by this. How do these comedians, or in this case a director, how do they manage to remember their lines? And how do they know where to stand, and how do they have an understanding of? Well, of course, in Cronenberg's case, because he's behind the camera, he has an understanding of what needs to happen in front of the camera.
Yeah, I remember an interview with him about it. And he was frequently asked, "Why have you done it?" Because you're not in it for 5 minutes; you're in it for a good hour. When combined, he's in it for quite a bit. He's got a lot of screen time, he's got a lot of presence, and he's got a lot of action, and he's quite pivotal. Even though he's not the protagonist, he's quite pivotal in the story and what happens to the protagonist and why the protagonist ends up doing what they do. And he said he just wanted to be a better director. He wanted to experience it on the other side. Like you say, he's got a vast amount of experience behind the camera, but not so much in front of it. And if I remember correctly, I think he said after 4 or 5 years afterwards, in other interviews, that it made him a better director, that he now understood what it was like to hit your mark, something as simple as that, or how you can change the meaning of something in the way in which you moderate your voice. So I think it's kind of interesting, and particularly someone like Cronenberg, you wouldn't expect him to step in front of the camera. And I think it's also interesting that since he did Nightbreed, he's appeared in lots of other films as well. He hasn't just, okay, I've done Nightbreed and that's it. He was in, of all things, he's in the opening sequence to Jason X, the Friday the 13th film that's set in space, and he plays another psychiatrist, another doctor, and he's kind of slightly ironic, quite amusing in it. And he's done another film, I can't quite remember what it's called, about a haunted, it's either a haunted hotel or a mansion or a stately home, and he's in it again for quite a bit. So that's, there's something there. It's like you said about something like End of Violence. We wouldn't expect that film from Cronenberg, and we wouldn't expect Cronenberg to act, but there he is, and he's producing all of this increasingly complex and increasingly interesting and creative body of work the more and more he does it. I mean, he's recently written a novel as well, hasn't he? He's written, I can't remember what that was called, it might be Consumption.
Well, that was his original aim, wasn't it, really, to be a novelist, following in the footsteps of his father as a writer.
And it's a fixation with Burroughs as well, which we talked about before we were recording, about Secret Weapons as well, the sort of the television program that he did in 1972. And that is just like a template for William Burroughs and for his subsequent film that Cronenberg adapts from his most famous book, Naked Lunch. There's all of those things, they just connect. It's like literally connecting the dots, and they all come from these 4 films.
Yeah, well, literary influence, it's often mentioned, influence of Samuel Beckett on, for example, Transfer from the Drain. We'll move on to From the Drain now, actually, saying that So 1967, another very short film. It's coming in at just shy of 15 minutes. You can tell us a little bit your thoughts on this as in a way of also setting out the plot. Oddly enough, during both Transfer and From the Drain, doing the rewatching recently on Blu-ray high definition, but both of them made me laugh at various points, which is interesting. Again, you don't often associate Cronenberg with chuckles.
No. I was watching Transfer in preparation for this recording, and I was watching it, and I was kind of just thinking, it feels like a long time. It feels long, and it's kind of clunky, and it doesn't quite work. But I'm okay with that because it's one of his first films. That's okay, but it's there. It's in my sort of thoughts. But then when I watch From the Drain, I'm just kind of thinking, here comes Cronenberg. This is going to be the first sort of real instance of body horror, and seeing these monstrous things that he's interested in first emerge in film. But I think you're right about that sense of humor, because From the Drain opens with a shot of two men inside a bathtub, and I think the first line is, "Do you come here often?" And it's bizarre. It's really funny because it's obviously a chat-up line, but then it's just dismissed. But then as it progresses, as the dialogue develops, we find out that the two men are potentially war veterans, and one of them is looking for the War Veterans Recreation Centre. And they begin to talk about various things, and they start to develop that dialogue. And you start to think, why would they come here often? Why are they coming here? Who's coming here again? And where are they actually going? And what is this War Veterans Recreation Centre? And what war are we actually talking about? Is it a future war? Because we can only see this bathtub and this kind of confines of this space. And it sort of drifts into more, I guess, like we were saying earlier about patient and doctor sort of dialogue, where one seems to be interrogating the other a bit more about where they've been and what they've done and all of those sort of things. And eventually it kind of ends with this creature coming out of the drain and strangling one of them, while the other watches somewhat impassively, and concludes with the person that's been murdered, killed, eaten, consumed, however you want to see it. The other character picks up their shoe and throws it into a cupboard full of shoes. So this has clearly happened before. So in the space of those 10 to 15 minutes, an absolutely awful lot is actually happening, and a lot of Cronenbergian things are happening. And that's why I think I probably connected with it better than I did with Transfer. I could see something more exponential, but then I watched them in order. So there is a clear development from Transfer to From the Drain.
If you look at the period publicity for Shivers, 1975, which is Cronenberg's first actual, what he considered to be a movie rather than a film in air quotes, obviously bathtub is right there, you have the person in the bathtub, something emerging from the drain, and then there's a sexual dimension to that as well. The tagline reads, "Terror beyond the power of priest or science to exercise," and they came from within is also a tagline. So when it was years and years and years after seeing Shivers that I saw From the Drain, but straight away it was like this, again, it's this visceral dimension, bathrooms, toilets, drains, all of that.
They're very private spaces, aren't they?
Yeah, yes, yeah, I think that's what I'm driving at you.
They're very private spaces, and they're sexual spaces as well. We're usually, for the most part, partially clothed or naked when we're in them, and we're exposed, our bodies are exposed. And also, more often than not, in bathrooms, toilets, things like that, there are mirrors, so we can see ourselves reflected. So there's all sorts of almost sort of psychosexual things going on in his choice of location. And although those things aren't sort of predominant in From the Drain, it is just literally a room and a bathtub. It's almost what I was talking about earlier, that frustration that he hasn't got the money, he hasn't got the budget, he hasn't got the location to have in it all the things that he wants in it at that point. and they find their manifestation later on. And like you said, in something like Shivers and things like that, that he's got the budget, he can have all of these other sort of visual symbols in the space. But I think, yeah, there's something about that, and that goes back perhaps to that patient-doctor dynamic, in that even though the men are clothed and in the middle of nowhere having dinner, in Transfer, one is exposing themselves to the other in quite a kind of clear way. They're sort of saying, this is how I feel, this is my emotions, this is what's happening, these are my thoughts, I'm worried about my thoughts. There's a different sense of exposure. But then that finds itself much more physical in these later films. And I suppose in a way, it's a strange connection to make, but it also makes me think about the absolutely horrendously violent, completely all male, all naked fight, the conflict in History of Violence, or is it Eastern Promises? It's Eastern Promises.
Yeah, they're in the, is it in the sauna, I think?
The sauna.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, they did it in a real sauna, and they really beat each other up. And they both, I think there's 3 or 4 of them actually, they're all naked and they're all battling it out. And there's that visceral nature to it again, that sense of the body being incredibly fragile. So what people say, oh, you know, Eastern Promises, that's not a David Cronenberg film. It's kind of like, well, it is. It's the same concern, the fragility of the body, the exposure of the body, the blood of the body, and how fragile it is. And it's just this kind of looseness that can be easily broken. And in some films, it's a disease, a sexually transmitted disease that does that. In other films like Dead Ringers, it's a doctor's or a gynecologist's scalpel. But in Eastern Promises, it's men grappling with each other and really hurting one another. It's all the same sort of thing. And I suppose you mentioned Crash as well earlier. In Crash, it's a piece of metal going through a body at some force, or a piece of glass going through a body at some force. So all of those things, although they seem very disconnected, so From the Drain, Dead Ringers, Eastern Promises, they don't seem connected, but they actually are when you start to piece them together. And it's this, you were saying earlier about how these are the starting points for Cronenberg. It's arguable that he hasn't ended. He's still growing, he's still developing, he's still working out other ways of talking about what he wants to talk about. And that's possibly that lineage from Transfer, From the Drain, to something like Eastern Promises.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, even if you look at A History of Violence, 2 of the scenes that stick in my mind of many in that movie are orientated around sex. There's one scene where the protagonist, Mortensen's, and his wife have sex, and it's you know, it's a moment where they're out of themselves. You know, they're no longer, it's no longer a psychological thing. It becomes purely physical. You know, visceral. They're going at it like bunny rabbits. You know, and it's like, and there's another one where after he, again, it's not really a spoiler alert, but after the truth of his background has been revealed to his wife, that again they have sex, and there's just such a different dynamic. The kind of, you know, she looks so powerful, he looks so weak, and it's on the stairs, if you remember that scene. It's kind of like, it's really horrible in a way, but again, what's ostensibly a gangster film, maybe not. That's the guy's background, you know, more fully played out in Eastern Promises, but nevertheless, there it is. It's this dimension that creeps into the film again, that's inserted in there, that again, for me, for anybody, there's probably lots of people who watched that film who maybe weren't familiar with Cronenberg, you know, because it had quite a cinematic run, you know, and I can see how that would appeal to people who've got no interest in sci-fi or horror, but those little moments just put in there is something I think is consciously or otherwise something that you can't help but do, because as you say, it's reinforcing, it's exploring his concerns, some of his key interests.
It proves to a great extent that he's an author of his films, that although you've got cast and crew of hundreds, if not thousands of people ultimately on a film, his sense of vision and what he wants to communicate about the world are implicit. And I think that's why, in terms of analysing Cronenberg, I always kind of thought when they were finally released that something like History of Violence and Eastern Promises are far more valuable in that respect than falling on the crutch of something as obvious as The Fly. It's easy to analyse The Fly, but it's not so easy to look at Eastern Promises or History of Violence as a Cronenberg film. But they are, without doubt, they're Cronenberg films. It's just that visceralness, that sense of the body, the psychology, the dynamic between someone in power and someone who isn't, that doctor-patient relationship just plays itself out in a different way. And perhaps that is a little bit more disturbing, a little bit more frightening than actually having it literally played out in front of you. Man turns into a fly. It's horrific. But what happens when sort of like we see this loving relationship and there's really quite a dark and nasty, quite horrendous secret and history within that relationship? And what happens when that gets exposed, when that's revealed? And how does that sort of transform the dynamic? And I guess if we're going to be discussing to an extent Cronenberg's sort of relationship with sexual relationships and sexual acts, then Crash is, you know, such an incredibly powerful film in that respect, and how he deals with almost every scene has got some sort of sexual activity taking place in it, but how he turns it into something so cold and so completely sterile in this world where everything's sterile and cold. There's no emotion even in those moments of intimacy until the very, very end. And that's not giving anything away, but until the very end, there might be that first glimmer of love again, that intimacy that we're so familiar with lots of other mainstream films when they have scenes of sexual connection and sexual intimacy.
So fast forwarding to Stereo 1969, well, sexuality comes up in this again. This, for me, is where Cronenberg's interest in parapsychology really comes to the fore. We have an institute. I mean, the number of times that institute comes up in his films is ridiculous. But he has this obsession with these, you know, these academic organizations, doesn't he? And of course, it transferring from the Drain, filmed at Stereo actually, filmed on site at his college, you know, as he was a student at the time. So yeah, this institute, an academy, and telepathy is being explored in this environment, but being developed through sexual exploration, shall we say. The idea being that, and there's an underlying idea here that in terms of human evolution and, you know, society, that the family unit is obsolete, and that's to be transcended in some way. Again, all these very, you know, transgressive ideas in terms of culture, society, sexuality. It's almost like, you know, Cronenberg keeps presenting us with this idea that that sort of the nuclear family and the way that we do things now is archaic, you know, and somehow quaint, you know, and should be done away with. Again, it's a very common theme in science fiction in general, isn't it? You know, future development of humans, you know, where that might go.
But it is quite explicit in Cronenberg's work, all the more so because when he divorced I think it was his first wife, it was quite traumatic, and there were children involved and things like that, and that manifests itself in The Brood, doesn't it? That's what The Brood is based on. This horror film about this mother giving birth to these demonic children is fundamentally his, I think it's often quoted, it's his version of Kramer versus Kramer. And you kind of see how, you know, particularly in these early films, it's quite literal how he's working through the idea of that perhaps we don't need families anymore, perhaps we don't need conventional ways of doing things or conventional ways of sort of reproduction. And when I was looking through my notes, and one of the things that I wrote about stereo was that one of the first things that struck me is the brutalist architecture. Without doubt, he films that location fantastically. It's full of concrete, there's an incredible amount of straight edges, there's this constant play of light and dark, and this building, this institute, this place of what we perceive to be revolutionary thinking, cutting edge technology, new ways forward, progressive, positive things for the world, just becomes this archetypal kind of Gothic castle. It's full of pockets of shadow, full of pockets of light. And our doctor is this vampire. The first time we see him, he's in a long black sort of Count Dracula, Christopher Lee-esque cape. And it flows around him, it billows around him like some sort of vampiric moment. And he starts to, in inverted commas, suck the blood or the psychic sort of energy, the emotions, the feelings that all of his patients have. And there's that relationship again, doctor and patient, and the perhaps the lack of symbiosis between them. But the thing that really struck me in terms of kind of like the sex and sexuality of it all is that the people that we see in it, the patients, they have a more physical, a more sexual relationship with the building and its materials than they do with each other. And there's that kind of there's a couple of key images of one of the patients, one of the women. She's naked and she's laid down on a piece of perspex, and we can just see her, she's backlit, and she's sort of writhing around on this piece of perspex. And then later on we see her pressing herself against some glass, and again it's quite sexual, the way in which she moves, the way in which she stands. And then there's the scene in which the man is he's naked and he's interacting sexually with the dummy, the medical dummy, where you can take its body parts out and things like that and look at all the internal organs. There seems to be a greater relationship with the inanimate than there is with the animate, with flesh and blood. So it's there again, and then that is a precursor again, as we said earlier, that these films all seem to be leading somewhere. Arguably, this is a pilot for Crash, in which people enjoy themselves sexually more in a car, in the relationship between their bodies and a car, or their bodies and the textures and feelings and the tones and the shapes of a car. And ultimately that reaches its, no pun intended, the climax of the car crash. And so there's a lot going on in there. And yeah, I think Stereo is it's beautifully shot. It's really beautifully shot, but disturbing as well. You can't get away from how disturbing it all is.
Yeah, you mentioned well, two things I want to pick up on. One was the brutalist architecture. Obviously, say Stereo filmed on campus by Cronenberg. It's something that has recurred time and time again in his work. Maybe just tangentially, but this sort of focus on the built environment, as I get the impression, not an afterthought. Not just we're filming here because we're here, as it were. And one thing that struck me was in Scanners, which I mentioned at the top of the hour as my introduction to Cronenberg, the significance of the building, the institute or whatever the name they're giving it, the corporation in that film. And we see in Stereo, there's a shot of a helicopter outside the building. Is that Stereo or Crimes of the Future? But there's also a similar shot. There's a helicopter lands outside the corporate building in Scanners. Yeah. So
it's definitely repeated. We see it first in Stereo, and then we see it again. I think it is in a later film, but it's that idea, isn't it, of this? It's always the doctor, the psychiatrist, the scientist, the intelligent individual that comes in the helicopter, and they're coming out of the sky, aren't they? They're coming out from this space of considered power, this almost celestial space, and they come down and they land and step out in these sort of grand and regal ways and start to almost lay waste through their experimentation. I was just looking through my notes, and one of the things that the voiceover says is, as a result of this sort of vampiric psychiatrist that's come out of the sky in this helicopter, two of them commit suicide and one drills their head. And again, I think, isn't that a connection with Scanners? Doesn't someone drill their
Yeah,
head?
yeah. There's a like a trepanning, or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, in order to, I can't remember which character it is, but in order to try and ease the pressure, which is of course what the original idea behind trepanning and lobotomy, all that was, does that. Yeah, you can see the scar from the drill. Yeah.
So there is that, again, that sort of symbiosis. But you're right, that it is without doubt a purposeful choice of location and a purposeful framing of the figures and the characters and the protagonist and the antagonist and the light and the dark. There's that bit in Stereo where there's the individual on their own above the corridor. So they're stood in a concrete corner and we can see a window. So this character's on their own, getting frustrated and angry and unable to deal with things. But through the window that we can see the psychiatrist and two other patients having a really good time. And the psychiatrist keeps looking up and knows what they're doing. They know how much they're tormenting the other patient, but it's all done through the language of the building and the construction of the composition of the building, the glass, the concrete. We can see through the glass, we can't see through the concrete, those hard surfaces, reflective surfaces. It all becomes a little bit more symbolic the more you talk about it, or the more that you look at individual frames. You start to think, there is a choice here, an active choice about why that body's being pressed against glass, or why that hand is not just touching concrete but caressing concrete. There's a lot going on in what you said, just quite simply, the brutalist architecture.
Yeah, there's to mention again the sort of doctor-patient relationship dynamic. Speaking about Stereo, I mean, in Scanners you have Patrick McGowan's character, Dr. Paul Ruth, and then you have the vulnerable kind of vagrant Cameron Vale, who's the one that's trying to come to terms with resist. He's suffering from his gift, as it were, his telepathy, psychokinesis, this ability that he has, that he shares with a small number of other human beings on the planet. And it's interesting, you see that paternal thing from Ruth, as again Patrick McGowan's character, the sort of like only I understand you, and you're my patient, you're my tool, your ability I exploit. So it's the whole dynamic. But again, what does that say about the Doctor's character, about his own abilities, insecurities, whatever? So that dynamic again plays out again and again in Cronenberg's films. I mentioned Scanners here particularly because I did read a review of Stereo, which said that Scanners was basically like a follow-on, or the film that most closely develops the themes.
I was kind of, again, looking at my notes. There's a section about that the idea of the telepath, and how one of them, the doctor, whose name is Luther Stringfellow. I mean, like, these institutes have these fantastic names, like Soma Free. These doctors have got fantastic names. Luther Stringfellow, Luther, that whole kind of devil and things like that are all.
Yeah, and Adrian Tripod.
Yeah. But they're fantastic names. But they become believable in this sort of future world that he seems to be wanting to create in these 4 films. I think it's kind of interesting, but we've not actually said that these films feel like they're in the future, and really they're the only sort of films that deal with the future in his entire sort of body of work. Because something like, there were 2 that we talked about that weren't Cronenberg, are Cronenberg. History of Violence and Eastern Promises are set now, ostensibly now, in the time in which they're made. Dead Ringers is just the same. The Fly's the same. Scanners is the same. they're all set now. And Shivers, the one he makes, like you said, the movie he makes after these films, is set in a completely recognizable and tangible Canada. And the same with the film after that, Rabbit. We can recognize those places. But in these films, these locations are not recognizable. They're in the future, but we can still see ourselves in them. And I think you talked earlier about how unnerving they can be. That might be part of it, that idea that we don't recognize this institute, but we do recognize the institute. We do recognize some of that brutalism. We do recognize the concrete, the juxtaposition between concrete and glass, all of those sort of things. They're all kind of there, but they're not there. They're sort of in the future, and they're inhabited by these future scientists, these people that are creative minds. Luther Stringfellow, who wants to use telepathy to advance the world and progress the world, just like Scanners. But obviously in Scanners it takes a much more twisted, a much more sort of demented turn. But that in itself, from a almost like a hauntological point of view, it kind of echoes all of the mythologies, conspiracies, that realities, however you want to frame it, from however you want to think about it, about the psychic experiments conducted by various military institutions to see if telepathy could do the things that people said it could. And we all know about remote viewing and things like that. It all kind of cycles back into Cronenberg's future worlds, but they're not future worlds, they're today's world. If that makes sense. I don't know. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder if, as much as he's concerned with the body, there seems to be this kind of, we use the term body horror, which comes up, in the oeuvre of many writers and directors, this kind of impatience, dissatisfaction with the physical form. In terms of evolution, which is something that does come up in Crimes of the Future, actually, that's the last of the 4 films we're talking about, 1970. Obviously, as I say, we're talking about Cronenberg more generally, but the idea of human evolution comes up there, and I wonder if Cronenberg shares the idea that I kind of have, and that many other people have expressed, that if we look at human evolution, how far back do we need to go before we see anything meaningful in terms of change? And that's controversial in itself, because are we evolved from apes? Are we evolved from dolphins? I throw that in because that comes up in Crimes of the Future. Is there an aquatic background? But is physical human evolution over with? And is the mind, is the arena of the mind the future of our evolution? Is it mental, or spiritual, or whatever? And in many of Cronenberg's works, you could see that idea there, that is the landscape that we developed.
It's definitely there, isn't it, in his work? It's something about the next step. And I suppose, again, the most obvious one, I keep saying it's the most obvious one, it's way more complicated film than I'm perhaps making it out to be, but The Fly is, I think the first line of dialogue in it is something very similar to like the absurdity of From the Drain. And it's just, we hear Brundle saying, I think it's sort of, the screen's still black at this point from the opening credits, he says something along the lines of, this is going to revolutionize the world. It's going to change the world. It's going to change travel. It's going to change the world. It's going to change communication. He perceives it as the next step. And that is every single Cronenberg doctor or psychiatrist. They believe that they are ushering in the next step in our lives. And it's something more palatable in The Fly. It's transportation. But in something like Crimes of the Future and Stereo, it's something way more abstract and way more unusual, in that notion of telepathy, opening up sexual awakening, sexual sort of relationships, and that leads into other things. And it's the same as Scanners. It's the next step is all going to be in our minds. We're not going to talk. We're going to talk to each other through our minds and those sort of things. But it always goes wrong. And that's a bit of a guess a bit of a cliche. It's a typical science sort of from Frankenstein onwards, really, isn't it? Science fiction trope that the scientist believes they're right, but ultimately they're wrong, and they pay a big price for it. And Brundle certainly does in The Fly. And Beho's, I suppose, it's Darryl Reebok, isn't it? In Scanners, he pays a massive price for his abilities. All of those things are kind of there, and there's this constant thing in his work, isn't there, that he's almost frustrated that we're not moving forward, and his characters are frustrated that they're not moving forward. So yeah, there's definitely something there about the next sort of body, the next evolutionary step. But yes, perhaps Rabid might be one that's quite a good one to talk about in that respect as well, because of the surgery that Marilyn Chambers' character undergoes transforms her into a next evolutionary step, a new biological form in terms of what it means to be human.
Rabid, I mean, where do you want to go with this in terms of, like, you know, disease and public health response and things that you and I perhaps have lived through with the pandemic that we never perhaps imagined in a million years that we'd ever live through. Again, that's something that I think Cronenberg would, I'd love to have heard his thoughts about what happened during the pandemic and as again, our response to it, both personally, publicly, you know, on all fronts.
I think what you were saying about disease is something we've not sort of really talked about, and it's something that you do have to talk about with Cronenberg, is that he does have a very focused interest in sexually transmitted diseases and how they can be used to talk about our contemporary condition, and how they can be used to talk about our relationships to each other. And I think we're kind of talking about these four films as being the core, and we keep moving away from them. And I think that's quite important in any discussion about Cronenberg, particularly his early work. You can't see them in isolation. You've got to see them as a body of work, as a big picture, or chapters in a book. They build up this greater sort of picture. And I think it's kind of interesting that he has quite a clear preoccupation with sexually transmitted disease, and then it kind of stops after The Fly, and he starts to think about sexual relationships in a different way. And I suppose it's epoch, really. It's kind of apex, is crash, and how dislocated we can come from those sort of experiences. But disease is something that's kind of important, because when we talk about doctors and these, like Dr. Luther Stringfellow and his vision for the future, it's automatically disease free. He's not bothered about that. He's bothered about other consciousnesses. He's bothered about other communications, other sort of sexual contact. And it's only after these four films that Cronenberg starts to think, a minute, the physical leads to something disastrous. And I mean, like you said, it's on pandemic scale. In Shivers, the entire apartment block ends up infected, and in Rabid, there's the potential for it to go global. Those sort of things are all there. So he's kind of hauntological in that respect as well, isn't he? He's predicting a future that ultimately, like you said, we would never in a decades of think we'll be back into a pandemic situation. We'd be in a situation where we're all locked in our houses for fear of contracting a disease, an illness.
Thinking about Crash and J.G. Ballard, you know, the author of the book, I found it interesting when I first encountered, or I first started to think about architecture in the context of Cronenberg's films, when I saw Scanners, you know, in that building. I don't know why, I noted it, shall we say. You know, I again, as I said earlier, I realized this was not an accidental thing. It wasn't just any old building that he could locate consec in. And then I thought about Ballard's, his own obsessions and interests, and how that, you know, architecture plays part of it. I seem to remember in Crash, there's definitely a dimension of that. I mean, both in the book and the film. But you look at Ballard's book, he's one of my favorite authors, by the way. I mean, High Rise
Yeah, High
um,
Rise is a great one.
and also Concrete Island.
Yeah, Concrete Island.
And I could easily see. I know High Rise has been filmed, but again, there's for me were like Cronenberg projects kind of waiting to happen
Mm.
in some way. So it's interesting when you see these things, these interests or predilections or obsessions occurring not just amongst different, writers or filmmakers or whatever, but where their work actually overlaps.
There's a synergy between them, isn't there? I mean, Cronenberg, you could position Cronenberg at the epicenter of it, but then he would be on the outskirts of other writers or directors if you position them in the epicenter. I know that sounds a bit daft to say, but I think a lot of writers and sort of filmmakers, they sort of connect with Cronenberg in lots of different ways. And obviously, we've said it earlier, Beckett is there, there's Burroughs is definitely there, and Ballard is definitely there as well. I think when you were talking about Ballard and how those things are translated by Cronenberg, Crash is, although it's got an intense and unsurprising preoccupation with cars and looking at cars and cameras moving along cars, as naked bodies, both male and female, move along cars and touch cars and interact with cars. There's also that quite intense interaction with concrete again. And again, I'm kind of on my screen, I've got some images from Stereo. And the more I look at them as we're talking, the more I can see visual connections between what's going on in Stereo and what we see in Crash. And I'm thinking of the scene in particular when James Spader and Deborah Kara Unger are talking, I think, about the day he's filming, because he plays, if I remember correctly, he's a film producer. And they're looking out on their high-rise balcony out into the sort of the metropolis. And slowly but surely, they engage in some sort of sexual activity, which is unsurprising given the film. But it's not their interaction he's interested in. He's interested in Deborah Kara Unger's body and hands, arms, legs, any other body part that eventually gets revealed in relationship to that concrete, in relation to the railing, in relation to the metal. And that's there again. It's there and there and there and again and again and again and again. And it's just that there seems to be with him that people have greater connection with the inanimate, with the cold, with the sterile, with the man-made, with the brutalist, than perhaps with each other. And just kind of thinking, I said earlier about this, that in the final scenes there's genuine, in inverted commas, intimacy, there's love, there's emotion in there. And perhaps it's no coincidence, given what we've said about the women, the men, the nudity, the sexuality is all taking place against concrete and glass, and it's emotionless. When that final scene takes place, when that final potentially genuinely intimate moment takes place, they're lying on grass. They're lying in a natural environment. They're in contact with each other and not in contact with concrete, with glass, with metal railings. I think it's kind of, I don't know, perhaps we're exposing something that we didn't necessarily think would come out of this discussion, but there is clearly something going on with architecture, brutalism, bodies, and transformation.
There is absolutely. And again, it was something that I hadn't really considered beforehand. It's something that, from my part, came up, as we started our discussion. So that's interesting in itself. I'll throw in, before I forget, we were talking about cars, in Crash. But of course, my first exposure to stereo and Crimes of the Future was the bonus disc that came with the original DVD release of Fast Company.
Yeah.
Again, a film that not many people who think of Cronenberg will necessarily think of that. But a quite massive petrol head, the guy, which you would never really guess, looking at him.
I think I remember, again, my quotes from Cronenberg interviews are sketchy at best, but I'm sure he said, or he might have been joking or mocking, but I'm sure he said something to the lines of, he got Playboy to just read the stuff about the cars. He had no interest in nothing else, given all the films that he'd made up until that point, no interest in anything else, but he just wanted to look at the cars. You're right, he's an absolute, like you say, he's a petrol head, isn't he? He loves cars. And then again, it's not a surprise that he made Fast Company, and it's not a surprise that he made Crash. And it's almost like, there's another, almost like there's like an essay, there's an article, there's another discussion, there's another interview, the relationship between Fast Company and Crash. What's the dynamic? Where's the lineage, and where's the shared sort of language? I mean, even thinking about it, I get them confused. In Eastern Promises and A History of Violence, I think it's A History of Violence. It begins with a continuous take of a car moving slowly past individual sort of hotel rooms in like a typical American sort of motel. And the car moves along, stops, someone gets out, goes into the room, comes back out, the car moves. We're not sure why. We do find out at the very end of the shot, but the shot's more preoccupied with the car and its movement and how it appears in the sunlight, in the early morning sunlight, than anything else. And that is, again, that obsession, not just with buildings and Brutalist, but that obsession with cars, the sleekness of them, the metal, the way in which light reflects off them. It's all kind of there, because everyone talks about Cronenberg, sexually transmitted diseases, transformation, and mental illness. There's other things going on, and it's that architecture and that preoccupation with cars. He just likes cars.
Is Maps to the Stars the one that's shot in the
Oh,
inside?
No, Cosmopolisis.
Oh yeah, sorry, yeah, I met
yeah,
this later films getting them mixed up, but
yeah,
that's kind of you could factor that in, I suppose.
yeah.
And what was the idea behind that? In terms of its having it set in a car.
But that's an interesting sort of thing for a filmmaker like Cronenberg, isn't it? How do you make a film when you're David Cronenberg with all of that heritage behind you and ultimately cultural sort of baggage? How do you make a film that's set completely inside of a car, or predominantly inside of a car? Because you're dealing with a limited space, limited sort of imagery, and also you're working with one actor, and Robert Pattinson, wasn't it?
We're going right back to transferring from the drain in that case. Beckett, the idea of slow cinema, the idea of like this is actually a stage play or whatever. It's so narrow. You don't have all of the toys and the bells and whistles usually available to the medium of the movie. That's all gone away.
And that connects back with that shot that I talked about earlier, about that continuous shot of the car. It is very theatrical. It's not cinematic. It's theatrical. It's taking place in front of us. And although the car moves and the camera moves, everything feels static. Everything feels like it's taking place inside of the theatre, inside of that sort of arch, and you're looking through and you're watching it. And that's kind of quite an interesting sort of position to think about, how, because that's getting into a completely different discussion, isn't it, about how Cronenberg films and how he wants to present the world, and that comes before you're starting to analyze what's inside the image and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's really interesting sort of thing in analyzing Cronenberg as an actual technical sort of filmmaker. So I think, talking in the moment, never acutely aware of any sort of stylistic sense that gets in the way of understanding what's going on. Whereas if I watch a Christopher Nolan film, sort of Christopher Nolan's style interrupts the visual and it interrupts the narrative flow. I'm suddenly aware that Christopher Nolan's deliberately positioned the camera there, and they're incredible films and they're incredibly stylish and they're fantastic to watch. But if you can compare it to someone like Cronenberg, there is a visual interruption in Nolan's work that isn't in Cronenberg's. But when you start to break it down like you've just done, you start to think, actually, there are some absolutely staggering images in his films, and they're mostly still, and we're just sat there like in a theatre watching them.
So, considering Crimes of the Future again, set in 1997, which I can't remember if that's made explicit or not in the film, but it occurred to me that for another one of my obsessions, John Carpenter, Escape from New York is set in 1997. So consider these two events as contemporaneous, because at one point in Escape from New York, Hulk mentions to Snake Plissken, you know, that idea you had about, you know, flying off to Canada, you know, in the Gulf Fire. It's like, and but if you went to Canada in 1997, maybe the world of Adrian Tripod and the House of Skin and Antoine Rouge, and also there's been a plague. We're talking about pandemic, you know, that's
Yeah,
that's the background to Crimes of the Future,
yeah.
related to cosmetic products. Again,
Mm,
it's human augmentation, but at
yeah.
that very superficial level. But that which is left, you know, has led to deaths of,
Hmm.
you know, the entire population of sexually mature women in the film. So this is absolutely apocalyptic, but the film doesn't really come across as that, again, because, you know, small number of actors, you know, small cast,
Mm,
everything's quite tight and personal. So you don't really get a feeling in Crimes of the Future for what has actually occurred at this wider level. But we, you know, we follow Tripod as he seeks to discover the fate of his mentor Anton Rouge, and along the way, metaphysics. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of human evolution, what that
mm.
was in the past, and foot fetishism, pedophilia, the whole thing. Just absolutely, again, in synopsis, kind of like hellish, you know.
But I think from my kind of perspective, what you're talking about is the frustrations of, you said earlier again about not having the budget, not having the money, and it's really interesting that you compare it to Escape from New York, because that does have a budget and that does have a big cast, and it is apocalypse on the, you know, on a massive scale, and it's a fantastic film because of that. But I think the apocalypse in sort of Cronenberg's world, it it's just not what we expect, is it? And I think that's part of his skill, that's part of his uniqueness, is that apocalypse doesn't have to be Carpenter's version of the apocalypse. So I suppose in a way it's kind of like George Romero-esque apocalypse, isn't it? Because Night of the Living Dead, it's an apocalypse, isn't it? There's the world's going down badly. People are becoming zombies quickly. The infection, the pandemic is spreading fast. But we're still in a recognizable America. And even by Dawn of the Dead, when, you know, pretty much all of the population of America has been zombified, it's still recognizable. And that is a bit weird because it's all set in that mall, isn't it? It's all set in the consumerist Mecca, the shopping mall, and we still recognise it. I think that's part of the success of Crimes of the Future, is that there is this apocalypse, there is this thing that's happened, and it's catastrophic, but it hasn't resulted in the world going and disappearing and deteriorating and decaying. So I think he's interesting in how he perceives the apocalypse, how he perceives the kind of the end of man. And it is quite literally the end of man, isn't it, in Crimes of the Future? As you said, the women have been sort of killed off by this pandemic, by this plague, and the men are left. And it's, I don't know, it's a disturbing image of the apocalypse,
Yeah.
because, go on.
No, sorry, please finish your thought.
I was thinking how we're so used to seeing cinematic apocalypse like Escape from New York. It's become safe, hasn't it? It's become cozy. It might be the wrong word to use, given you're talking about film and sort of cozy Britain and cozy America and all of those sort of things. But it's safe. We're on familiar ground when we see the post-apocalyptic environment. I mean, you have it forced down your throat every week if you watch The Walking Dead. It's the apocalypse. It's got a certain aesthetic. It's got a certain texture, certain color, certain sound. Certain things have got to happen in that environment. And then when Cronenberg comes along, it's just like Canada. it's still normal Canada. And I think that's a quite disturbing, that half the population is gone, and yet the world still looks okay, and it becomes eerie, and it becomes uncanny. It becomes this that unsettling feeling slowly creeps into the film, is because, you, like you said, it's a journey, isn't it? It's a movement from A to B, and it goes through these environments, and it just creeps up on you how disturbing, or perhaps how quiet the world is, how lacking in certain things it is. It doesn't need to be an escape from New York apocalypse for it to be an apocalypse.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know, that's just kind of thinking out loud about
No, it's
those.
just it's very Canadian, isn't it? Really, having
Mm,
lived with a couple of Canadians before, I can contrast with North Americans.
mm,
I would one thing you said about quiet there, I'd refer listeners to one of my earlier blogs. I know this is audio, but I normally film these things, but I do look at the New Zealand film, The Quiet Earth,
mm,
and in terms of like an apocalypse that's literally silent,
mhm,
that's worth reviewing, both my review and the film. Yeah, I was reading something the other day about John Wyndham and
mhm.
his influence on cinema, and how many of his stories have been adapted, specifically the influence of the Day of the Triffids on 28 Days Later.
Yeah,
But the reason I bring this up is because one of the reviewers referred to, I think it might have been an original review of Day of the Triffids book, as a cozy catastrophe,
yeah.
because it's the end of the world as we know it, but the protagonists seem to be relatively unfazed in a way.
Mm.
It's the British stiff upper lip and all that, carrying on, keep calm and carry on sort of thing. And you'd see that maybe not explicitly in the same way in something like Crimes of the Future, but as you say, the world is over as we know it. The future of the species is in doubt.
And that's definitely in 28 Days Later, isn't it? I mean, those opening images are fantastic in that film. They're just astoundingly brilliant. But there's no apocalypse. It's just emptiness and silence, and the knocked over little trinkets of Big Ben in front of Big Ben. It's brilliant. It's very anti North American apocalypse, I suppose, isn't it? North American film, North American apocalypse. It's big, it's brash, it's disastrous, it's things falling off things, it's big explosions, it's decay, it's rot, all of that sort of aesthetic. But then sort of Cronenberg comes along and the world's just a bit dirtier. And
Mm.
when we do it in Britain, it's kind of like it's just very messy.
Well, I'm reminded of this isn't directly applicable, I don't think, but I was often struck by the contrast in terms of, say, like nuclear war, the contrast between something like Threads,
Yeah.
or even the War Game, but let's just say Threads as a famous example,
Mm.
and an American production like The Day After,
Yeah.
which finds the protagonists about half an hour into the film laughing their heads off. I remember just being a bit uneasy with that. Guys, you really understood what's happened here, But I was reminded, actually, in Crimes of the Future, I say I rewatched it just recently for the purposes of our discussion, and I was reminded of Children of Men, the movie,
Yeah.
but also the Children of Men, the original novel, and also Greybeard by Brian Aldiss, which I'd recommend. Again, to do with sterility and
Mm.
reproduction, the end of the species because we can no longer reproduce.
Hmm.
And that ties in Cronenberg's universe, with the whole dimension of sexuality, doesn't it? Because
Yeah.
yeah, there's sexual pleasure, there's deviance, there's all of the psychosexual dimensions. But at the end of the day, it's a reproductive function. That's
Yeah.
why the sex drive is so strong, because
Mm.
nature or the universe or some such wants us to keep making babies to propagate the species.
But he, again, in that classic flawed doctor, psychiatrist, scientist, that almost that Frankenstein theme again of a man subverting or avoiding any sort of sexual contact. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, isn't there? A man who doesn't want to engage in sexual activity for either pleasure or for reproductive purposes. There's something interesting about that. But when you said that stuff, I was thinking of in The Brood, sexual reproduction is no longer needed. It they asexually reproduce. They produce themselves. There's that own process of self-reproduction. So that's kind of quite interesting in relation to that. But also in The Fly, he's reborn. He's transforming into something. He's reproducing himself into something else. And that's by technological means. So there's those, you're right, there's those sort of ideas are there, but I'm not sure he fully grapples with them. I'm not sure he fully, or if he wants to fully grapple with them, they're not perhaps his predominant concern. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier on when you said about those two specific scenes in A History of Violence, and that dynamic and the shift in those scenes and how that can be connected to something as perhaps as aggressive, if that's the right word, given how cold and sterile it is, how crashes in those relationships. But it seems like reproduction isn't really necessary in his world. It's either not needed or it's not able to occur. And he sort of pushes it out of the way, because in Crash, the intimacy isn't about reproduction. It's just about being with someone else, or being in a car with someone else and enjoying that experience. Don't know, have you got any other thoughts on it?
You've summed it up really there about what the experience is about. You know, that the loss of the idea of, you know, of reproduction and the commodification of the sexual experience, you know, as purely being a superficial thing, you know, the orgasm, and that's it, and the loss of the understanding, or the even the feeling of what that is about. And of course, sex for pleasure is, I would say, how long has it been? I don't know. In terms of human history, it's a predominant form of that activity. It's recreation, you know. It's look, prophylactics. It's mostly not for reproduction, you know. It's just purely, it's like the rat, you know, the lab rat, you know, that starved itself, you know, because it was just constant pleasure, forgetting to eat and all the rest of it, you know. And we could get into other areas that Cronenberg does as well, about that drive within us, you know, how that affects our behavior and our functioning and our thinking and psychology. I mean, there's Freud wrote books on it, you know. I think he's largely discredited, you know. I'm more of a Jungian than a Freudian, to be honest with you, but nevertheless, there it is. There's a whole industry on this, you know, whether it's from sexual psychology through to bloody sex toys, you know. It's one of the predominant human you know, preoccupations.
But it's classic Cronenberg that he's pushed it to one side. It's kind of like, I'm not going to deal with that. I don't want to deal with that. I want to deal with something far more complex and far more sort of challenging in terms of it. And I think kind of, I keep thinking about Dead Ringers, but I haven't watched it enough. I've only seen it twice, and it was a long, long time ago. But that just keeps cropping up in my mind in this discussion about how that patient doctor dynamic that we talked about, and the sexual relationships that Elliot and Beverly have, either with each other or not with each other, and with and without their patients, and observing each other and those sort of things. And also, I suppose it needs to be mentioned that Amazon recently remade Dead Ringers with Rachel Weisz playing the twins. And what does that bring to that dialogue? Because Cronenberg's credited, obviously. It's based on his film, not the original novel. All of those sort of things. Where's it all sort of going, and what's it all sort of doing? But for someone who's often in this discussion, you kind of think about Cronenberg as being someone who's often criticised for sexual content or sexual contact. But when you talk about it in this context, I don't think there's actually that much going on. I don't think there's nothing going on in it. And if it does occur, like you quite rightly pointed out, it is purposeful, particularly in A History of Violence. It isn't just there for the sake of it being there, or for some need that the audience require in a specific type of film. It's there because it has its place. And I think what's interesting is that, thinking about it, sort of in the moment. The Fly has that quality that A History of Violence has, because Brundle's very tentative about having a sexual relationship with Gina Davis's character. He's a fumbling, bumbling, plastic, sort of self-centered, self-focused scientist. And then once he's gone through the teleportation process, and once he's started to have his genes mix with that of the Fly, his sex drive goes wild, and he's athletic, he's powerful, he wants to have constant interaction, he wants sexual contact all of the time, and it becomes purposeful again. There's a reason why that's happening. So again, there's another entirely different sort of discussion, the use of that activity as non-reproduction within the films of David Cronenberg.
Yes, well, I suppose we should wrap the discussion around about this point, because it's open-ended and potentially never-ending. Some of the themes that we've just been talking about, you fast forward from Crimes of the Future in 1970 to Shivers in 1975 and Rabid in 77, you see a lot of that, these themes coming through. So whether listeners are, entirely familiar with Cronenberg's work or entirely unfamiliar, hopefully this has given some impetus to explore it, because there's so many themes of concern here, I think, that are, universal. As far as I know, Cronenberg has a film in production.
Yeah.
The Shrouds, I don't know anything about it whatsoever, but it'll be very interesting to find out what his themes are there. Don't know if you know anything about it.
I kind of sort of now try and avoid reading about people like Cronenberg's films or Romero's films when he was alive, or Carpenter's films, because I like the idea of going into them a little bit cold and having just my own expectation instead of the expectations that previews have built up in the trailer and that sort of thing. But that doesn't mean to say that I've avoided anything about the Shrouds. And what I've read, I think it's about you're able to watch the process of decay of your loved ones once they're dead. I think there's this, I think I've seen an image where coffins are made of glass and they're upright and you can go and watch. But obviously that can't be the whole narrative. There can't be a whole film about watching someone.
No, it's yeah, I didn't even know that, to be honest with you. It's to do with connection with the dead, basically, those that have passed on. And
is this part of the evolution of Cronenberg that we've been talking about? He's going through all of these different cycles about life, about reproduction, about evolution, about progress. And perhaps this is part of his, not his conclusion, but there's a point where he's saying, well, I've got to tackle this final stage, the fragility of the body, the frailty of it all. And I guess that's in The Fly when Brundle starts to fall apart. It's definitely in Crash when the bodies are penetrated, in inverted commas, through glass and metal. All of those sort of things are all sort of they're all there, and it's all leading towards, I think it's kind of interesting, David Cronenberg, horror film director, but doesn't really deal with death, does he? Doesn't really overtly tackle with, grotesque violent deaths as normal horror films do. He tackles things that are far more sort of esoteric, I guess.
yeah, I think horror is too narrow. It does him a disservice, really. And people maybe who haven't viewed his work might accept that, but I think they would hopefully rethink it if they explored it. Maybe in this latest film, remains to be seen, for all his body obsession and thinking about physicality and sensuality and sexuality and all the deviations spinning off from that, then maybe this will be present the idea that that we're not our bodies, actually, that I talked about mental evolution, that maybe the body is just a vehicle for consciousness, as it were, that ultimately it's a transitory thing, but that's no, life doesn't begin when we're born, it doesn't end when the physical body dies. That concept, we'll see.
Yeah, but that's definitely in Stereo and Crimes of the Future, isn't it? That notion of, and the body, it's an undercurrent. So the body is it's a vessel, for other things. It's a container, and evolution isn't in the body. It's in the mind. It's in the esoteric. It's in the telepathic. It's in all of those sort of things. And yeah, it will be interesting to see if Shrouds makes those links and makes those connections, because it would be a bit bonkers to think that that line of thought, or that train of inquiry that's in Crimes of the Future in stereo, is still being played out in another way in his latest film, or at least a film that will be released in 2024.
Okay, so just before we sign off, if listeners are interested in reading what you've writ, books, articles, stuff in magazines, various things that you've done, where should they go? Just go on Amazon, search your name, or if they want, if they were.
If listeners go onto Amazon, and the easiest, I do have an author page, but there are other James Roses out there. So it would be easier to go to Amazon and just put in Beyond Hammer, and the cover will come up. It's got Simon Pegg playing Shaun from Shaun of the Dead on it. And if you click on my author name with that book, that will take you to all of the books that Amazon, all the books that Amazon has that I've written, and I've also been a participant in. It's the easiest way to access things like that, really, because my website's really more of a like a CV, a space in which I just catalogue all the things that I've done, because obviously the copyright for the writing that I do doesn't belong to me. It belongs with the people that have commissioned the writing. So yeah, Amazon's the best place to start. I think it's kind of interesting, because as much as we've been talking about Cronenberg for the past hour and 40 minutes, I don't actually think I've written and published anything about Cronenberg. But as I said right at the start, he was one of the key instrumental filmmakers that said to me through their films, this film could be something else. It can be so much more than just, at that time, 90 minutes of popcorn entertainment. It can be something that you can see, and hopefully that's reflected in the writing that I've been doing.
Splendid. Well, once again, James, thank you so much for joining us today
Thank you very
on
much.
LegalizeFreedom.com.
LegalizeFreedom.com